The ocean breathed below the cliffs, slow and steady, as if the world itself had fallen asleep. On the hill stood the Whitmore house, glass and white stone glinting under the pale California Sunday. From a distance, it looked perfect, a house designed by a man who once believed in light. But up close, every window reflected loneliness. Inside, silence pressed against the walls like fog against glass. Graham Whitmore sat at his desk, motionless, staring at the screen in front of him, though nothing on it held meaning anymore. He was an architect, a man who had once drawn homes filled with warmth and laughter. Now, even the home he built for himself had forgotten how to breathe. The cursor blinked on an empty blueprint, the echo of an unfinished life. 3 years had passed since the night Clara's car slid off the wet road, and everything inside him collapsed. He remembered her laughter in the kitchen, the way she hummed when the coffee percolated, the faint trace of cinnamon she always left in the air. Those sounds had vanished, leaving behind a silence that had weight. Down the hall, in the small pink room facing the sea, his daughter lay still on her bed, 7 years old, but too quiet for her age. Ilara hadn't eaten for 2 weeks. The doctors had come and gone, their words all blurring into the same helpless advice. Nutritionists, therapists, all of them left with kind eyes and empty hands. She didn't cry or move, just stared at the ceiling, as though she was watching something invisible that only she could see. On her bedside table sat a bowl of untouched soup, the surface forming a thin film under the cold air. Martha Langford, the housekeeper who had served the family for over 20 years, walked quietly into Graham's office. She placed a steaming cup of coffee beside him. The gesture was automatic, the way she had done it every morning since Clara's passing. "She's still not eating, is she?" Graham asked without looking up. His voice sounded hollow, metallic, a man-shaped echo. Martha shook her head. "No, sir. We've tried everything. She won't even touch the juice." He nodded slowly, eyes drifting toward the window. Beyond it, the horizon stretched in gray and silver tones, the seagulls drifting low, their wings cutting across the wind. Somewhere below, waves broke against the rocks, over and over, constant, patient, indifferent. He wondered how something could move endlessly and feel nothing at all. Night came early that evening. Lights filled the house, soft and sterile. But none of them reached the heart of it. In the dining room, 2 plates sat opposite each other, one half empty, one untouched. Graham pushed food around without appetite. The sound of cutlery on porcelain was too loud, too real. When he finally stood, the chair's creak echoed like a sigh. He turned off the lights and walked down the corridor. Ilara's door was open just a crack. From the doorway, he could see her small figure under the blanket, her hair spilling over the pillow. He hesitated, fingers tightening on the doorframe. He wanted to speak, to tell her something. Anything but words felt foreign now. In the silence, he thought he heard the faint rhythm of her breathing. So fragile, he was afraid even his thoughts might disturb it. Back in his study, he sat again in the same chair, staring at the photo on his desk. It was tilted, almost falling out of its frame. Clara and Ilara, taken on the beach one summer morning. His wife's laughter was frozen mid-air. Sunlight caught in her hair. He straightened the frame carefully, as if afraid to hurt the memory. "I built this house for you," he whispered. "Now it's just walls." Outside, the wind shifted, bringing the smell of salt and damp earth. The house creaked faintly, wood contracting, glass trembling. Graham closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down. Somewhere deep inside, guilt gnawed softly, like a tide that never stopped returning. The clock ticked past midnight, though time no longer had shape in that house. Graham sat by the window, the faint reflection of his own face blending with the darkness outside. Somewhere below, the ocean kept breathing slow, relentless. He wondered when his life had started to sound like the sea, steady, empty, endless. Martha moved softly through the hallway, her slippers barely making a sound on the polished floor. She paused outside Ilara's door, holding the tray she brought every night. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "I left your dinner by the bed." She waited a few seconds, listening for movement. Nothing. She sighed and turned away. The tray clinked slightly as she carried it back to the kitchen, the soup untouched, the bread stiff and cold. Downstairs, she found Graham still in his study, the lamp throwing a warm circle of light over his desk. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "it's late. You should rest. I'll rest when she does, he murmured. Martha hesitated at the door. Sir, she needs you. Graham's shoulders stiffened. I'm right here. With respect, Martha said, her voice trembling. You're here in body, not in spirit. The child feels that. He looked at her for a long time, the words caught somewhere between pride and pain. Finally, he said quietly, Good night, Martha. She nodded, wiping her eyes as she turned away. When she was gone, Graham leaned back, exhaling. He wanted to be angry at Martha, at fate, at the mirror of himself staring back from the glass, but anger took energy, and he had none left. He rubbed his temples, the ghost of a headache pressing behind his eyes. Once, he had been called the man who built homes that breathe. He had designed spaces filled with air, light, and flow, houses that felt alive. Now, his own creation suffocated him. He walked through the darkened halls, past the piano Clara used to play, past the gallery of framed sketches, his sketches that once earned him awards. At the end of the corridor, he stopped before the balcony doors. The ocean shimmered under the moonlight, and the sound of waves rose like whispers calling from below. He opened the doors. The cold wind bit at his skin, carrying the scent of salt and rosemary from the garden. I did everything I could, he said to the night. I gave her the best doctors, the best care. Why isn't it enough? The wind answered with silence. He thought of Clara, how she would have known what to do, how her voice could calm storms. He missed her in the quiet ways one misses air, constantly, unconsciously, with every breath. The weight of that longing pressed harder than grief itself. Back inside, the grandfather clock struck 1. Graham turned off the remaining lights and walked toward his daughter's room once more. He opened the door slowly, careful not to wake her if she slept. The nightlight cast a small golden pool beside her bed. Elara lay facing the window, her tiny hands curled near her chest. Her breathing was steady now, but shallow, fragile, like the last notes of a song. He stepped closer. For a moment, he thought of touching her hair, the way he used to when she was a baby. But fear stopped him, fear that she would turn away, that even comfort might break her. He whispered instead, his voice low and uneven. I'm still here, little one. I just don't know how to reach you. There was no answer, only the soft hum of the ocean outside and the faint rustle of curtains. He stood there for a long moment, memorizing the shape of her in the half-light. Then he turned and left, closing the door with a quiet click. Back in the kitchen, Martha had cleaned everything, leaving the counter spotless, the kettle ready for morning. On the marble island sat a note she had written and forgotten to take upstairs. Some things can't be fixed with plans, sir, only with love. Graham found it hours later, when dawn began to color the sky in shades of pink and silver. He read it twice, his throat tightening. Outside, the first seagull cried over the cliffs, and the waves rolled in, calm and endless, as though the sea itself was waiting for something to return. The house stood silent above it all, proud, immaculate, and hollow, the house once called the House of Light. Next morning, Martha opened the front door to a knock that came just as the sun rose. A woman stood there, holding a faded canvas bag, her sneakers worn, her smile soft as morning light. Good morning, she said. I'm Isabel Duarte. The agency sent me for the kitchen assistant position. Martha blinked, startled by the warmth in her tone. You're late, she said automatically. The bus broke down, Isabel replied, her eyes kind. I took 3 different ones to get here. Behind her, the waves crashed against the rocks again, steady as a heartbeat. The old house seemed to shiver, as if something or someone had finally found its way back to life. The morning fog lifted slowly from the cliffs, revealing the line where the sea met the sky, soft gray against soft blue. Martha stood in the doorway, still holding her apron, watching the stranger on the porch. Isabel Duarte looked nothing like the people who usually came through that gate. Her clothes were plain, her hair tied back loosely, her shoes scuffed from long walks. Yet there was a calmness about her, a kind of quiet that seemed to steady the air around her. You came from Monterey? Martha asked, leading her inside. From Salinas, actually, Isabel said, setting her small bag by the wall. The agency called me yesterday, said you needed help in the kitchen. Martha hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. We did, though I'm not sure Mr. Whitmore is ready for anyone new. Isabel smiled faintly. Grief never makes space for strangers, but sometimes strangers bring space to grief. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Martha wasn't sure why, but she nodded. "Follow me, then." They passed through the long hallway. Every sound, their footsteps, the creak of wood, the hum of the refrigerator echoed too clearly. The house seemed to listen. In the kitchen, the morning light fell through wide glass panes onto the marble counters. Everything gleamed, organized, untouched. Isabel ran her fingers lightly along a bowl of fruit, as if feeling for life. "You could perform surgery in here," she murmured. Martha smiled despite herself. "Mr. Whitmore likes order. Does he like silence too?" "More than most people," Martha said, and her eyes softened. "Though I don't think he chose it." End of Crete. They began preparing breakfast. Isabel worked quietly, efficiently, moving like someone who had learned to take care without making noise. When she cracked the eggs, she hummed a tune under her breath, faint but steady. It was an old Spanish lullaby, simple and circular, the kind mothers sing while washing dishes. The melody curled through the kitchen, rising with the scent of butter and toast. For the first time in weeks, the house did not sound entirely empty. Upstairs, Graham stirred awake. He lay in bed for a moment, unsure what had changed. The air smelled different, warm, alive, like something familiar from long ago. He pushed himself up and walked to the window. The fog had burned away. The ocean shimmered, but it wasn't the view that held him. It was the sound, a low hum, threading through the morning. Not music exactly, but not silence either. He dressed and came downstairs. The hallway lights flickered on automatically as he passed. When he reached the kitchen door, he paused. Isabel stood by the stove, turning pancakes, the sleeves of her shirt rolled up. Martha was at the counter slicing fruit. It looked like a scene from a home that didn't belong to him anymore. "Who's this?" he asked. His voice startled them both. Martha turned quickly. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Isabel Duarte, the agency center. We needed help. I didn't approve another hire." "No, sir," Martha said, setting down the knife. "But I thought—" Graham's gaze shifted to Isabel. She met it without fear, only quiet respect. "If you'd rather I leave, I will," she said calmly. "But I can cook, clean, and keep to myself. I just asked for the chance to help." Her voice carried no apology, only sincerity. Graham hesitated. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft hiss of butter in the pan. He finally said, "Fine. Temporary." "Of course," Isabel replied, returning to the stove. "Temporary is how everything begins." Ugh. He almost smiled, but stopped himself. He picked up a cup from the counter, poured coffee, and left the room without another word. When he was gone, Martha exhaled. "You shouldn't talk to him like that," she whispered. "He's not easy." Isabel turned off the burner. No one is when they're still learning how to live with ghosts. After breakfast, the house returned to its rhythm of quiet routine. Graham retreated to his study, where sketches lay scattered across his desk, outlines of buildings that looked perfect, on paper yet hollow in meaning. Martha cleaned upstairs, her footsteps faint on the wooden stairs. The only new sound was the gentle rustle of Isabel moving through the kitchen, opening cabinets, humming softly. When she finished washing the last plate, Isabel noticed a half-open door across the hall. It was painted pale pink, the color slightly faded. She could sense it wasn't a room meant to be entered by strangers. Yet something in her urged to look. She knocked lightly, then pushed the door just enough to peer inside. The small bedroom faced the ocean. Toys sat untouched on a shelf, a dollhouse with its front wall missing, a stack of picture books covered with dust. By the window stood a little girl, thin as a reed, her hair tangled, her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the sea. She didn't turn when the door creaked. "Hello," Isabel said softly. "I'm Isabel. I help in the kitchen." No reply, only the sound of waves below the cliffs. Isabel stepped inside a few feet and looked around. On the table beside the bed lay a drawing, a crayon sketch of a woman holding a loaf of bread. The lines were rough but careful, drawn with the fragile precision of a child who wanted to remember something. Isabel picked it up gently. "You drew this?" she asked. The girl spoke at last, her voice hoarse from disuse. "That's my mom. She looks kind," Isabel said. "Did she bake?" She used to make bread every Sunday, Ilara murmured. Her gaze didn't move from the horizon. Now nobody does. Isabel nodded slowly. That's a beautiful tradition. Maybe we can try it again one day. Ilara shrugged, her expression unreadable. Bread doesn't taste the same without her. Isabel didn't answer. She just smiled softly and placed the drawing back on the table. Maybe not the same, she said after a pause. But sometimes the smell can help us remember the good parts. Before the girl could respond, a sharp voice came from the hallway. What are you doing in here? Graham stood at the door, his face pale, eyes flashing between them. I was just introducing myself, Isabel said calmly. She was awake. I told Martha no one disturbs her room. Ilara turned away quickly, pulling her blanket over her shoulders. Isabel stepped back, but her tone remained even. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I thought you might like company. She doesn't, Graham said flatly. The silence between them tightened. Then Isabel spoke again, her voice almost a whisper.
Sometimes people don't know what they need until someone stays long enough to ask.
Graham's jaw clenched. Just stay out of that room. He closed the door, more gently than he meant to, but the sound still carried down the hall like a small thunder. Later in the kitchen, Martha found Isabel kneading dough. You shouldn't have gone up there, she said, shaking her head. He's protective. I understand, Isabel replied. But that child is fading. Martha leaned against the counter, weary. You saw it too. I saw her eyes, Isabel said. They're looking for someone to see her back. Martha hesitated. Mr. Whitmore loves that girl more than life itself, but he doesn't know how to reach her anymore. Since his wife died, he's been... She searched for the word, half a man. Isabel pressed her hands into the dough, shaping it with slow precision. Then maybe it's time someone reminded him what the other half was made of. As the oven warmed, the scent of yeast and butter began to fill the house, curling through corridors that hadn't carried warmth in years. Upstairs, Ilara lifted her head slightly, sniffing the air. The smell reached her like a memory too soft to resist. She slid off the bed and padded to the window. The sea stretched wide and blue below, but it wasn't the ocean she was listening to anymore. It was the quiet hum of life returning, faint but real. In his study, Graham paused mid-sketch. The fragrance drifted under the door, and for reasons he couldn't explain, his chest tightened. He closed his eyes, the smell of baking bread pulling him somewhere he hadn't dared go. Sunday mornings, when Clara left, the radio played softly, and Ilara's giggles echoed down the hall. Outside, gulls circled in the pale sky. Inside, the oven timer ticked, and Isabel smiled faintly to herself. Every house, she whispered, remembers how to breathe again. It just needs a little warmth. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale fog and the smell of the sea. Isabel woke early, long before the house stirred. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and stood at the kitchen counter. The silence of dawn was different from the silence of grief, softer, almost expectant. She measured flour with careful hands, letting each scoop fall like slow snow into the bowl. The kitchen clock ticked quietly as she mixed the ingredients: flour, salt, yeast, warm milk. Every movement was deliberate, reverent, like she was building something sacred out of the simplest things. She didn't bake for herself. She baked for the house, for the people inside it who had forgotten the sound of life. Martha entered, still wearing her robe, and stopped at the doorway. You're up early. Old habits, Isabel said with a smile. My mother used to say, bread only listens to the patient. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, Isabel replied, pressing her thumb into the dough to test its softness. She also said, you can't rush healing, not in people, not in bread. Martha leaned against the doorframe, watching the younger woman's hands work. If that's true, this house could use a whole bakery. Isabel laughed softly. Then we'll start one loaf at a time. By the time the sun touched the ocean's edge, the scent of fresh dough filled the halls again. It drifted upstairs, curling around closed doors, waking memories. Graham stirred in bed, blinking at the light filtering through the curtains. That smell, again the same one from yesterday. Warm, familiar, dangerous, because it reminded him of something he didn't want to remember. He got up, buttoned his shirt, and went downstairs. Isabel stood near the oven, a kitchen towel draped over her shoulder. The loaf sat cooling on a rack, golden and imperfectly shaped. She looked up when he entered. "Morning," she said, calm and steady. He hesitated. "You're baking again." "I am. I didn't ask you to." "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "But sometimes houses ask in their own way." Her tone wasn't defiant, only simple truth. He didn't respond. The smell of butter and yeast filled the room between them. For a moment, he almost said something human, but instead he poured his coffee and left. Martha walked in right after. "You'll scare him off talking like that." Isabel smiled faintly. Maybe he needs to be scared at least enough to feel again. Later that morning, as she washed dishes, Isabel saw a small shadow in the hallway. She dried her hands and turned. Ilara stood there, barefoot, her hair slightly neater than yesterday. Her eyes flicked from the loaf on the counter to Isabel's face, uncertain. "Hi," Isabel said softly, as if greeting a bird that might fly away at any sudden sound. "You're up early too." The girl didn't answer, but stepped a little closer. Her gaze lingered on the bread. "It's still warm," Isabel offered. "Would you like a piece?" Ilara shook her head quickly. "I'm not hungry." "That's okay," Isabel said. "You don't have to be." She cut a small slice anyway, steam rising from the crust. The smell deepened rich, earthy, alive. Isabel placed it on a plate and set it on the table, not pushing it closer, not insisting. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "we don't eat because we're hungry. We eat because something inside us remembers how." Ilara frowned, uncertain. "Remembers what?" "What it feels like to be cared for." The words seemed to hover in the air. Isabel turned back to the sink, humming that same tune again, the lullaby from the day before. Ilara stood still, torn between fear and curiosity. Finally, she stepped closer to the table. The bread's crust crackled softly under her small fingers. She touched it, then took a bite so tiny it barely counted. But it was enough. Her eyes widened, not at the taste, but at the memory it carried. For a split second, she was back in the kitchen with her mother, laughter mixing with the sound of the radio, the smell of flour on her hands. She swallowed, blinking fast, then looked toward Isabel. "You put honey in it," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "Only a little," Isabel replied without turning around. "Your mother used to, didn't she?" Ilara froze. "How do you know that?" Isabel dried her hand slowly. "Because mothers love the sound of children's joy, and honey makes them smile sooner." Ilara looked down, holding the small piece of bread like it was something fragile. Her throat tightened. She wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come. Instead, she whispered, "It tastes warm." Isabel nodded. "That's a good start." The scent of baked bread drifted upstairs, curling under the door of Graham's study. He had been staring at his computer for hours, the cursor blinking against a blank page. The house felt quieter than usual, not empty, but waiting. A soft sound reached him through the floorboards. A faint clatter of dishes, followed by a small voice. He froze. It wasn't Martha, and it wasn't Isabel. It was higher, lighter, Ilara. Graham pushed his chair back and followed the sound. His footsteps slowed down the stairs. He stopped at the doorway to the kitchen. What he saw made his chest tighten until he could barely breathe. Ilara sat at the table, barefoot, hair still messy, wearing one of her mother's old sweaters that hung loose around her shoulders. In front of her was a slice of bread, golden and soft. Isabel sat across from her, not speaking, only watching with patient eyes. Ilara lifted the piece to her lips. Graham wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but his throat closed. He stood completely still as the little girl took a bite, a real bite, and chewed. A single crumb clung to her cheek. The moment was so small, yet it shattered something inside him. For 2 weeks, he had tried everything. Doctors, therapists, nutritionists. None of them could reach her. But now, in a quiet kitchen with a stranger and a loaf of bread, his daughter was doing the impossible. He stepped closer, voice low. "Ilara?" She turned, startled. A bit of color rose to her pale cheeks. "Daddy!" His heart nearly broke at the sound. "You're eating." Ilara hesitated, glancing toward Isabel as if asking permission. Isabel gave a small nod, the kind that said, "You're safe." "I was hungry," Ilara murmured. Graham knelt beside her, his hands trembling. "Sweetheart, I've missed your voice." The little girl didn't know what to say. She just held up the crust, half smiling through the fear. "It tastes like Mom." He blinked hard, unable to speak. The words hit him with the force of everything he'd been avoiding her absence. His guilt, the quiet walls he'd built around his heart. Isabel spoke softly from across the table. "Sometimes, Mr. Whitmore, people don't need a doctor. They just need a reason to remember love still exists." Graham looked at her. There was no judgment in her tone, only kindness. He nodded slowly, the muscles in his jaw tight. "I've tried everything," he whispered. "Everything money could buy." "Money builds walls," Isabel said gently, "but warmth builds doors." He swallowed hard. The smell of bread filled his lungs like oxygen. He reached out and touched Alara's hand, warm, alive, real. "I'm here," he said, voice breaking. "And I'm not going anywhere this time." The girl's lips trembled. Then she leaned forward, wrapping her thin arms around his neck. It was a fragile embrace, but it carried the weight of all the words they hadn't said. Martha stood in the hallway, watching with a hand over her mouth. Her eyes glistened. The light from the window shifted, turning the room golden. The waves outside crashed softly against the cliffs. Isabel turned away, pretending to tidy the counter, giving father and daughter space. When Graham finally looked up, she was wiping her hands on a towel, calm as ever. "Thank you," he said quietly. Isabel met his gaze. "Don't thank me, sir. Just keep showing up for her." "A1." He nodded, understanding more than he could say. Ilara looked between them, the woman who had made her remember, and the father who had finally heard her silence. "Can we have more tomorrow?" she asked shyly. Isabel smiled, her eyes warm. "We'll bake it together next time." Graham's voice softened. "Together," he repeated. Outside, the sky cleared completely, the fog dissolving into sunlight. The house, for the first time in years, smelled like home. That night, as the sea wind brushed against the windows, Graham lay awake, hearing Alara's laughter echo faintly down the hall. He hadn't heard that sound since Clara's death, but in the quiet, he also heard another voice, Isabel's whispering like prayer through memory. "Every house can breathe again. It just needs a little warmth." He didn't know it yet, but the stranger in his kitchen had just begun to heal more than one broken heart. The following days passed with a rhythm the house had long forgotten. Mornings began with the scent of baking bread, afternoons with the soft chatter of Alara's footsteps down the hall. The silence that once haunted every room had been replaced by something gentler, a heartbeat returning to life. Graham found himself lingering in the kitchen more often. He told himself it was because he wanted coffee, but it wasn't the coffee that drew him. It was the warmth, the sound of two voices, Isabel's low hum and Ilara's quiet laughter. One afternoon, he stood by the window while they worked at the table. Ilara was kneading dough, her small hands dusted with flour. Isabel guided her gently, never correcting, only encouraging. "Don't press too hard," Isabel said. "Let it breathe a little. Bread gets nervous when it's scared." Ilara giggled. "Bread can't be scared, can't it?" Isabel smiled. "Sometimes, when you rush it, it won't rise. It hides inside itself." The child frowned, pretending to think deeply. "So, it's like Daddy?" Graham nearly choked on his coffee. Isabel glanced at him, trying not to laugh. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I think your dad's learning to rise again." He looked at her, wanting to smile, but not trusting himself to. There was something in her eyes, calm, deep, and strangely familiar. Later that evening, after Ilara had gone to bed, Graham stayed behind in the kitchen. Isabel was cleaning the counter, the last of the daylight fading through the window. "Isabel," he said quietly, "you've been here, what, a week?" 8 days, she replied, drying her hands. He nodded. "In 8 days, you've done what no one else could." "I didn't do anything," she said simply. "Ilara remembered how to reach out. That's all." He watched her, unsure how to respond. The way she spoke reminded him of Clara, not her voice, but the way she made silence sound kind instead of heavy. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." He hesitated. "Why did you take this job? A house like this, it's far from town. The pay can't be much." Isabel looked down, folding the towel neatly. "Sometimes people go where they're needed, not where it's easy." Graham frowned slightly. "That sounds like something Clara would have said." She froze for the briefest moment. Then she smiled faintly. "Your wife?" "Yes," he said softly. She used to volunteer at shelters, teach art to kids. Always believed love was a kind of work. Isabel nodded. She sounds like someone who left light behind. She did, he murmured, his eyes drifting to the window. The evening mist had begun to rise again, swallowing the horizon. I just don't know how to find it anymore. Isabel didn't speak. Instead, she poured him another cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. You don't have to find light, she said gently. You just have to stop closing the curtains. Graham looked at her, startled by the quiet wisdom in her words. For a moment, he saw Clara again, not in Isabel's face, but in her warmth, the way she brought life back into things long forgotten. He wanted to ask her something else, but Ilara's voice interrupted from upstairs. Daddy, can you read me a story? He smiled faintly. Coming, sweetheart. Emma. When he turned back, Isabel was looking at him with that same patient calm. Go on, she said. She's been waiting for that story longer than she knows. He left the kitchen, her words echoing in his mind. Upstairs, Ilara was already tucked under the blanket. She handed him a worn book, one Clara used to read. As he began, his voice stumbled at first, but gradually softened, steadying with each line. Ilara rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time, the pain didn't feel like punishment. It felt like healing. Downstairs, Isabel quietly wiped the counter. When she glanced toward the old family photograph on the wall, Graham, Clara, and little Ilara, her eyes lingered longer than usual. Her hand trembled just slightly before she steadied it again. She whispered to herself, almost inaudible, You'd be proud of them, Clara. That night, the wind rose from the sea, brushing against the windows with a hollow, whispering sound. The house, half-lit and peaceful, carried the rhythm of a family slowly learning how to breathe again. Graham checked on Ilara once more. Before heading downstairs, she was already asleep, clutching the stuffed bear he'd thought she'd forgotten. When he entered the kitchen, Isabel was still there. The lights were dim, the oven off, but the air held a faint trace of warmth, cinnamon, and salt, the scent of earlier baking. She stood near the counter, holding something small in her hand. Graham spoke quietly so as not to startle her. You should get some rest. Martha will scold you for working overtime. Isabel turned. Couldn't sleep, she said simply. The sea sounds different tonight. It does that sometimes, he replied, stepping closer. Like it remembers too much. She smiled faintly, then set the object on the table, a small silver locket, old but polished, its hinges delicate with age. This fell behind one of the drawers when I was cleaning, she said. I thought it might be yours. Graham's breath caught. He recognized it instantly. The locket had belonged to Clara. He reached for it, with trembling fingers. When he opened it, the faint image inside stared back Clara on one side, Ilara on the other. The photo edges were worn, the faces smudged from years of touch. I thought this was lost, he murmured. It disappeared after the accident. Isabel looked down. Maybe it was just waiting to be found again. He turned the locket over in his hand. The back bore an engraving he hadn't seen in years. Love survives in the quiet things. Clara's handwriting, etched into metal. His throat tightened. Where exactly did you find it? He asked softly. Behind the top drawer in the study desk, Isabel answered. I was organizing the papers like Martha asked. He nodded, still staring at the locket. Strange. I emptied that drawer months ago. There was nothing there. Maybe it wanted to stay hidden until now, she said, voice calm but distant. He looked at her, really looked, and noticed for the first time the way her eyes caught the light, deep brown, flecked with gold. Something about them stirred a memory he couldn't place. Have we met before? He asked suddenly. Her expression flickered just for a heartbeat. Then she smiled politely. No, sir, I would remember. Forgive me, he said quickly. It's just, you remind me of Clara. Not in the way you look, but in the way you speak. The things you say. Isabel didn't answer right away. She glanced toward the window, where the reflection of the sea shimmered like liquid glass. Maybe grief has its own echo, she said quietly. Sometimes, when it needs to be heard again, it borrows another voice. He studied her, unsure what to make of that. There was a gentleness about her that felt too personal, too knowing. But before he could say more, Martha appeared at the door with her shawl around her shoulders. Mr. Whitmore, you're still awake, she said. It's past midnight. Couldn't sleep, he replied, slipping the locket into his pocket. Martha looked between them. The wind's turning cold. Best you both rest. Tomorrow will be another long day. Isabel nodded and began cleaning the table quietly. As Graham headed toward the hallway, he paused. "Thank you, Isabel," he said, his tone softer than before, "for finding this. It means more than you know." She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I do know." He lingered a second longer, then left the room. The hallway light flickered as he passed, fading into the quiet hum of the house. When she was alone again, Isabel leaned against the counter, breathing deeply. Her fingers brushed against her apron pocket there. Hidden beneath the fabric was another locket, identical in design but older, with a different engraving inside. "For Clara, when the world forgets, I'll remember." She held it tightly, eyes glistening in the dim light. "I kept my promise," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I remembered." Emplate. Outside, the wind calmed, and the waves softened against the rocks below, as if the sea itself was listening to her secret. Upstairs, Graham lay awake, the old locket resting on his nightstand. He turned it over again and again, tracing the engraving with his thumb. For the first time, he wondered who Isabel Duarte really was, and why every word she spoke sounded like something his wife would have said. Morning came with a soft drizzle, thin mist rolling in from the sea. The house glowed faintly under the gray light, quiet, steady, as if holding its breath. Graham sat at the breakfast table, untouched coffee in front of him, his mind far away. The silver locket lay beside his cup. Every few minutes, he'd glance at it, thumb brushing across the engraved words. "Love survives in the quiet things." He told himself it was nothing, a coincidence, a trick of nostalgia. Yet Isabel's words from the night before kept circling his thoughts. Maybe grief has its own echo. Across the kitchen, Isabel was slicing apples for Alara's lunch. She moved calmly, humming under her breath, as always. But this morning, her humming wasn't just gentle. It was familiar. Too familiar. Graham frowned. That tune, a soft, lilting melody, was the same lullaby Clara used to sing when Alara couldn't sleep. He remembered her sitting by the bed, the sound blending with the wind outside their old home. It was a song he hadn't heard since the funeral. He spoke before he could stop himself. "Where did you learn that song?" Isabel looked up, startled. "What song?" "The one you were humming," he said. "Just now." "Oh," she hesitated. "It's an old Spanish lullaby. My mother used to sing it." He studied her closely. "Clara learned that song from someone in her volunteer group. She used to tell me it came from a woman who worked at the shelter in Monterey." For the first time since she'd arrived, Isabel looked uneasy. "There are many lullabies like it," she said softly. "Maybe it's just coincidence." "Maybe," he replied, but his tone was distant. The air in the kitchen felt heavier after that. Even Alara, sitting at the counter with her coloring pencils, sensed it. She looked from her father to Isabel, her little brow furrowed. "Daddy," she said quietly, "are you mad at Miss Isabel?" He blinked, softening at once. "No, sweetheart." "Of course not." "Good," Alara said with relief, returning to her drawing. "Because she makes the house feel happy again." Isabel smiled faintly, but didn't meet Graham's eyes. Later that day, while Martha took Alara for a walk by the cliffs, Graham retreated to his study. The locket sat on his desk beside an old photo album he hadn't opened in years. Dust clung to the edges. He flipped through the pages. Clara at the beach, Clara holding baby Alara, Clara standing beside her favorite olive tree, sunlight on her hair. And then he stopped. In one photo, Clara wasn't alone. A younger woman stood beside her, smiling, an apron tied around her waist, a volunteer from the shelter, according to the faded note written on the back. The woman's name, scrawled in Clara's handwriting, read, Isabel D. He froze. The face in the photo was younger, yes, but unmistakable. The same brown eyes, the same quiet smile. He leaned back, heart pounding. So she had known Clara. That evening the storm rolled, and a restless wind sweeping through the house. The rain tapped against the windows like fingers on glass. Graham sat by the fire, staring at the locket in his hand, when Isabel appeared in the doorway, holding a folded blanket. You shouldn't sit so close to the cold window, she said softly. It makes the air heavy. He looked up slowly. You knew my wife. Her face remained calm, but her fingers tightened around the blanket. I did, she said after a pause. A long time ago. Oh? Why didn't you tell me? Because this job wasn't about the past, Isabel said. It was about the present. About your daughter. That's not an answer, he said, rising. His tone wasn't angry, just hollow. You came into this house knowing everything. Knowing me. Knowing Clara. She shook her head. I didn't come here for you, Mr. Whitmore. I came here because of her. Elada? Yes, Isabel whispered. Clara asked me to. Before the accident. The words landed like a stone. What do you mean? Isabel stepped closer to the firelight. Her eyes shimmered. Clara was worried. She said you were drifting away, that your work was taking more of you than your heart could afford. She told me, if something ever happens, promise me you'll make sure my daughter never forgets warmth. Graham stared at her, speechless. I promised her, Isabel said, her voice trembling for the first time. And when I read about the accident, I couldn't do nothing. I tried writing, but I never sent the letters. Years passed, and I thought maybe time had healed you both. But when I heard what happened to Alara, she stopped, her eyes filling. I knew Clara's promise wasn't finished. Graham turned away, staring at the fire. His voice was rough. So, you came here to fix us? No, Isabel said softly. I came to remind you that some things don't stay broken forever. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft crackle of firewood and the restless rain tapping against the windows. Graham stood rigid, the flames painting his face in unsteady gold. Isabel remained by the door, hands clasped in front of her, eyes lowered. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but sharp. So, all this time, you've been keeping secrets. I didn't mean to deceive you, Isabel said quietly. I just wanted to keep my promise to Clara. Lay. He turned to her, the words heavy with years of exhaustion. My wife trusted you enough to make you part of her dying wish. And you couldn't even tell me? I didn't want to intrude, she said. You were grieving. You'd already built your walls. My walls, he repeated bitterly. You think you understand what I lost? Isabel looked at him steadily. I don't claim to understand your pain, Mr. Whitmore, but I've seen what silence can do to a home. It starves the living, one day at a time. Her calmness infuriated him more than anger would have. You had no right, he said, his voice trembling, to come into my house, into my daughter's life, pretending this was coincidence. I didn't pretend, she said softly. I only waited for the right time to tell you. But then I saw what you were both carrying. And I thought maybe healing was more important than explanations. Get out, he said suddenly. Isabel's lips parted. What? You heard me, he said, turning away. I can't have strangers walking around wearing my wife's memories like they belong here. I don't know who you are anymore. The words came out harsher than he intended, but he didn't take them back. Isabel stood still, eyes glistening, then nodded slowly. All right, she said. If that's what you want. She left the room without another word. The moment she was gone, the house felt heavier again, as if the warmth she'd brought had been quietly stolen away. The fire popped and dimmed. Graham sat down, head in his hands, his breath unsteady. Upstairs, Alara had been listening. She had crept halfway down the staircase, clutching her stuffed bear. When she heard her father's voice break, something inside her twisted. The next morning, Isabel was packing her small canvas bag in the kitchen. The light was gray, the storm still muttering outside. Martha tried to convince her to stay. He didn't mean it, she said softly. He's just... I know, Isabel interrupted gently. He's lost too many times. People lash out when the past comes too close. Alara appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. You're leaving? Isabel knelt to her level. Just for a while, sweetheart. The little girl shook her head, tears gathering. But you can't. You said we'd bake together today. I know. Isabel brushed a strand of hair from her face. Sometimes, grown-ups need space to find their hearts again. But you can still bake. You already know how. Alara threw her arms around Isabel's neck, whispering through tears. Please don't go. Daddy needs you. He just doesn't know it yet. Isabel hugged her tightly, closing her eyes. Maybe you can remind him." When Ilara finally let go, Isabel stood, grabbed her bag, and stepped into the hallway. Graham stood there, motionless. His expression was tired, guarded, but his eyes betrayed something softer, something uncertain. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have told you sooner." He didn't reply. She waited, but no words came. Finally, she nodded once and walked past him toward the door. Ilara ran down the stairs, calling out, "Miss Isabel!" Graham turned as his daughter ran into the foyer, clutching the small loaf of bread they'd baked 2 days before, now hard and cold. She pushed it into Isabel's hands. "If you go," she said, "take this with you, so you don't forget us." Isabel looked down, her throat tightening. "Sweetheart, please," Ilara whispered. "You said love survives in the quiet things. Bread can be quiet, too." Isabel smiled through tears. "You're right." She glanced at Graham one last time, eyes filled with something deeper than farewell, something like faith. "Take care of her," she said softly. The door closed behind her with a whisper, and the house fell into silence once again. Hours passed before Graham realized how cold the kitchen had become. He walked in, saw the empty counter, and the absence struck him like a physical blow. His gaze fell to the table. Ilara's drawing lay there. 3 stick figures holding hands. The smallest one labeled me. The other 2 read Daddy and Miss Isabel. He sank into a chair, the locket heavy in his pocket, and whispered into the emptiness, "What have I done?" That night, Graham woke to the sound of his daughter crying in her sleep. As he held her close, she murmured a single word through her tears. "Isabel." He realized then that losing the woman's presence had reopened every wound he'd thought time had sealed. The storm outside began to fade, but inside, something in him had finally cracked open. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the sky washed pale and new. The air outside smelled of rain and salt, the kind that makes even sorrow look clean. But inside the Whitmore house, silence returned, heavier now, no longer healing, only empty. Graham stood by the kitchen window, watching the fog drift over the sea. On the counter beside him lay the half-finished loaf Ilara had given Isabel, forgotten and hard as stone. He picked it up, hearing her words echo in his mind. Love survives in the quiet things. He hadn't realized how much warmth she'd brought until it was gone. Soft footsteps sounded behind him. Ilara appeared, hair tangled, her small bear clutched tight. "Did she go?" she whispered. "Yes," he answered quietly. "Because of you?" He hesitated. "Because of both of us, maybe." Ilara climbed onto a chair, chin resting on her folded arms. She was the only one who made the house smell nice again. He tried to smile. "I know, sweetheart. Can we go find her? I don't know where she went." The girl looked at him with innocent certainty. "But you're Daddy. You can find anything." Her words struck him like light through fog. For the first time since Clara's death, he felt something stir, not guilt, not grief, but purpose. By mid-morning, he was in his study, papers scattered across the desk. Martha appeared in the doorway, watching him pull open drawers. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I need to find her address." "Mr. Whitmore," she sighed. "Maybe it's best to let things rest. She said she'd come back when it was time." He looked up. "She's not just another maid, Martha." "I know that," she said softly. "But chasing ghosts won't heal you." "This isn't about ghosts," he murmured. "It's about promises, the ones I broke and the ones she kept." At last, he found it a faded agency card with Isabel's handwriting. Salinas, California. He traced the ink with his thumb, a strange comfort blooming in his chest. "I'll be back by evening," he said, pulling on his coat. Martha frowned. "And Ilara? She's coming with me." "I know." Moments later, the truck rolled down the wet driveway, carrying father and daughter toward the open road. The sea stretched beside them, sunlight breaking through silver clouds. Ilara pressed her forehead to the window. "Daddy?" "Yes, honey? Do you think she misses us?" He smiled faintly. "If she doesn't, we'll remind her to." The drive south took hours. They passed quiet towns, old diners, and gas stations where life moved slowly, clothes swaying on porches, the smell of coffee in the air. Graham hadn't taken a road trip since Clara died. The radio hummed an old tune she loved. For once, he didn't turn it off. Ilara leaned forward. "Can we get her flowers?" "Flowers?" For Miss Isabel. She likes the yellow ones by the road. He slowed the truck, stopped, and helped her pick wild daisies. She held them close, smiling. These are happy flowers. They smell like sunshine. He watched her in the mirror, and for a moment, he saw Clara not in her face, but in her gentleness, in the belief that the world could still be kind. By the time they reached Salinas, the sun hung low and golden over the fields. Rows of crops glowed under the late light. They stopped at a small house with blue shutters and a wind chime swaying in the breeze. "Stay here, sweetheart," Graham said. Alara nodded, clutching the daisies. He walked to the porch and knocked. After a pause, the door opened. Isabel stood there, hair loosely tied, a soft shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "I didn't expect you." "I shouldn't have sent you away," he said. "You were angry," she replied. "People say harsh things when their hearts remember how to hurt." "I was wrong," he said, voice low. "You kept your promise to Clara. To Alara and I repaid you with suspicion. She motioned toward the small garden. "Would you like to come in?" Before he could answer, Alara burst from the truck, waving the daisies. "Miss Isabel!" Isabel knelt, arms open, as the child ran into her embrace. The flowers scattered across the porch. Tears filled Isabel's eyes. "You came all this way?" Alara nodded fiercely. "Because Daddy forgot how to say sorry." Graham stood behind them, silent, humbled, as the golden sun wrapped them all in its fading warmth. The late afternoon light painted the small kitchen in shades of gold. The air smelled of bread and rosemary, faint, familiar, and peaceful. Alara sat at the table, swinging her legs, nibbling a biscuit Isabel had just baked. Her laughter, soft and free, drifted through the room like a melody Graham hadn't heard in years. Isabel poured tea into 2 chipped cups, setting one before him. Graham looked around the worn curtains, the uneven floor, the wind chime's quiet rhythm outside. Everything in this home felt sincere, alive. "You have a beautiful place," he said quietly. "It's not much," Isabel replied with a smile, "but it remembers kindness." He nodded, holding the warm cup in both hands. Clara used to say that too. Isabel's eyes softened. "She was the kindest person I ever met." Silence lingered between them, filled only by the ticking clock. Then Graham spoke, his voice low. "You said she made you promise to look after Alara. But you also said she was worried about me. Did she know?" "Know what?" Isabel asked gently. "That I was drifting. That I wasn't the husband she deserved." Isabel hesitated. "Clara never blamed you. She loved you even when she saw you losing yourself. She once told me your brilliance was both your gift and your wound. She hoped time would teach you balance." He exhaled shakily. "But it didn't." She reached across the table, resting her hand over his. "Maybe it's teaching you now." For a long while, neither spoke. Alara hummed softly as she arranged her daisies in a small glass jar. The simple act seemed to fill the room with light. "After she died," Graham said, voice breaking, "I built more things, towers, houses, anything to fill the silence. But nothing I made ever felt like home again." Isabel's eyes glistened. "Because home isn't what we build. It's what we keep alive." He nodded, tears threatening. "I thought if I kept everything still, it wouldn't break again. But the stillness," she said softly, "was what nearly broke you." He smiled faintly through the ache. "Clara used to say grief isn't a room to stay in, it's a hallway we walk through together." "She told me that too," Isabel whispered. Their eyes met, not with romance, but with understanding. 2 people who had finally reached the same truth. Graham's voice trembled. "Her last days, were they peaceful?" Isabel nodded. "She was painting again. The morning before the accident, she told me, remind him to see the light in small things, even when he forgets where it comes from." He looked down, tears falling. "And I forgot." "No," Isabel said softly. "You just needed time to remember." Alara came over, small hand slipping into his. "Daddy," she said, "Mom's not gone. She's just quiet now like the house was. But we can make it breathe again, right?" Graham held her close, his voice trembling. "Yes, sweetheart, we can." Isabel turned to the window. The last sunlight touched the daisies, making them glow. Graham stood, taking a slow breath. "Come back with us," he said suddenly. "Not as an employee, as someone who's been part of our story all along." Isabel's eyes widened. "You don't owe me that." "I know," he said. "But maybe we owe it to Clara to finish what she started." Ilara's hopeful eyes turned toward Isabel. The woman hesitated, then smiled faintly. "All right," she said. "But only if we bake on Sundays." Graham laughed, a real, unguarded laugh. "It's a deal." Ilara clapped her hands. "And we'll call it Mom's Day bread." They all laughed, the sound soft and healing. Outside, the last light spilled over the fields. In that small house at the edge of Salinas, 3 hearts, one broken, one mending, one learning to love again, sat together as dusk fell, unafraid of the dark. Before leaving, Isabel stepped into her garden and touched a white flower blooming through the stones, fragile, impossible, alive. She whispered, "She kept her promise, Clara. He's found the light again." Behind her, Graham called gently, "Ready?" She turned, smiling. Home is waiting. And for the first time, the word home felt true again. When they returned to the house by the sea, dawn light spilled gently through the olive trees. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. Martha stood on the porch, eyes glistening. "Thank God," she whispered. "This house needed her." Ilara ran ahead, laughing. "Miss Isabel's home!" Her voice filled every corner that had once known silence. Inside, Isabel paused at the doorway. "It feels different," she said. Graham nodded. "Maybe because we are." Days slipped by in quiet harmony. The rhythm was simple: breakfast together, laughter in the halls, bread baking before noon. Even the walls seemed softer, as if the house itself had decided to forgive them. One morning, Ilara stood on her stool beside her father, pressing her tiny hands into flour. "Daddy," she said, "bread doesn't like to be rushed. It needs to rest like people." Graham smiled. "You're wiser than both of us." Ilara tilted her head, listening. "If you're quiet, you can hear the house breathe." He froze, then chuckled softly. "I think you're right." That afternoon, Isabel brought him tea on the porch. He was sketching the house, not perfect, just warm. "It looks alive," she said. "It finally is," he replied. "You were right. Houses don't need to be flawless. They just need heart." She smiled. "And forgiveness." He looked at her. "I'm still learning that part." "You already are," she said gently. Through the open window, Ilara's voice rose in a soft hum, the lullaby her mother once sang. Graham closed his eyes. "She sounds like Clara. She carries her light," Isabel whispered. He looked at her again. "And you helped us see it." For a moment, neither spoke. Only the sea and the steady heartbeat of a home reborn. That night, the sea was calm, moonlight, resting on the windows like silver dust. Ilara couldn't sleep. She padded softly down the hall, clutching a folded piece of paper. "Daddy," she whispered at his door. "I found something." Graham sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What is it, sweetheart?" "It was in Mom's old storybook," she said, handing it to him. "It's a letter. For you." He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting, gentle, looping, familiar, made his chest tighten. "My love, if you're reading this, I hope the sea still sounds like forgiveness. Don't let grief turn our home into a monument. Let it live. Let Ilara laugh. Let the walls breathe again. And when the time comes, let kindness back in, even if it wears another face." And the words blurred as his eyes filled. Isabel stood quietly at the doorway, unsure whether to speak. Graham looked up at her, voice trembling. "She wrote this for you too, didn't she?" Isabel nodded. "She wanted us both to remember that love isn't buried with the dead. It keeps growing, if we let it." He reached for her hand, no grand gesture, just gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, "for keeping her light alive when I couldn't." "Emter." Ilara climbed into his lap, resting her head against his chest. "So, we're all together now, right?" Graham smiled through tears. "Yes, sweetheart. All of us." Outside, the tide came in softly. Inside, the house once silent and cold seemed to breathe again. The letter lay on the table beside a single candle, its flame steady in the still air. And for the first time, Graham felt not the weight of loss, but the warmth of love that had never left. Morning sunlight spilled through the open windows, carrying the scent of bread and sea air. Elara stood on her stool, shaping dough beside Isabel, who stirred a pot of soup. Graham leaned on the doorway, smiling. "What's all this?" "It's light day, Daddy," Elara announced proudly. "The day our house started to breathe again," he chuckled. "Didn't know that was a holiday." "It is now," Isabel said gently. "A day to remember the light we found after darkness." Graham disappeared for a moment, then returned holding a small brass lantern. He placed it at the center of the table and lit it. The soft flame flickered across their faces. "This was Clara's," he said quietly. "She used it to keep the dark away when storms came." Elara's eyes glowed. "So she's here with us?" "She never really left," he said. They sat down, soup, bread, and simple joy between them. No grand speeches, no sorrow, just warmth, laughter, and the comfort of being together. Elara looked up suddenly. "Daddy, what does your heart say today?" He smiled. "That it's finally home." That evening, the sea shimmered under a soft, amber sky. The three of them sat on the porch, Graham, Isabel, and little Elara wrapped in a single blanket, watching the waves roll against the cliffs. Elara leaned her head on her father's shoulder. "Daddy, tell me the story again," she whispered. He smiled. "Once there was a house that forgot how to breathe," he began. "Its walls were quiet, its rooms cold. But one day, a kind woman brought warmth back, not with fire, but with love, and a little girl reminded her father how to listen to his heart again." Elara giggled. "That's us." "Yes," he said softly, his voice breaking just a little. "That's us." The lantern from earlier glowed beside them, steady against the wind. Isabel reached for Graham's hand, and he held hers without words. Above the ocean, the first stars appeared small, patient, eternal. For a long while they said nothing. The house behind them glowed with quiet light, alive once more. And in that stillness, Graham understood. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to love again and letting that love stay. The sea was quiet that evening, just as it had been the night Graham finally found forgiveness, not from others, but from himself. In that stillness, the story of a broken father, a grieving child, and a kind stranger came full circle. There were no miracles, no thunder, only the simple truth that love, when shared freely, can rebuild even the loneliest of homes. The Whitmore house, once silent and cold, now breathed again with laughter, warm bread, and the scent of second chances. Somewhere between the sound of the waves and the soft glow of that little lantern, they discovered what money, pride, and success could never buy: peace. Redemption rarely arrives with noise. It comes quietly in a shared meal, a held hand, or a promise kept. It's the steady heartbeat of someone saying, "I'm here," and truly meaning it. Like the porch light that stays on through a long American night, unconditional kindness can always guide us home, no matter how far we've wandered. So tonight, as you sip your tea or wait for a familiar voice on the phone, remember this: happiness isn't found in perfect moments, but in imperfect people who choose to stay. Love and forgiveness, those are the true architects of home. If this story touched your heart, press 1" the comments below. If you believe it could be told better, press 0 and share your thoughts. Because stories like this of love, loss, and light live on only when we share them together. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere in your own life, a small light still waits to be seen again.